Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Martinez, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Violence, Injury, and Trauma Action Team of HSMP. On behalf of the team, I am pleased to introduce Matila S. Jones. Ms. Jones is a skilled human services practitioner with over 10 years experience delivering, coordinating, and managing a variety of community service programs. Currently, Mrs. Jones is the Assistant Director of Community Engagement Services for the Family Tree, where she cultivates community partnerships that center on the provision of education, resources, and other materials designed to promote awareness of the biology around adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and community resilience. The Family Tree leads Maryland in preventing child abuse, connects caring communities, and builds strong families for generations. Please welcome Matila S. Jones.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for having me at the annual meeting today. We'll be talking about 4 particular concepts related to the science of adverse childhood experiences, as well as how both the brain as well as the body responds to traumatic experiences during childhood. My presentation is called Understanding N.E.A.R, and N.E.A.R is an acronym for Neuroscience, Epigenetics, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and Resilience. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how the body individually processes environmental stimuli from the environment and how changes to brain and body architecture can occur when children are exposed to trauma over the course of the lifespan. I'm also going to talk to you about the 1990 ACE study, the seminal epidemiological study that linked a relationship between multiple forms of adverse childhood experiences and negative health and social outcomes within community health. And then lastly, I'm going to talk to you about resilience and some local efforts throughout the state of Maryland towards ACE mitigation and prevention. So back in the 1990s, Dr. Vincent Felitti was practicing in the state of Florida, and he was noticing an alarming coincidence between some of his patients who were struggling with losing weight and those same patients reporting a history of childhood sexual abuse. In spite of the fact that these patients were experiencing negative health outcomes due to their obesity, they were really struggling with losing weight, even though Dr. Felitti was providing a wide range of tools and strategies for these patients to use in their weight loss journey. When Dr. Felitti noticed this relationship between a reported history of childhood sexual abuse and the patients who were struggling with their obesity, he was really puzzled. So he decided to reach out to his colleagues and community. Across the country in California, Dr. Anda, who was an epidemiologist, was studying the relationship between smoking cessation and trauma in childhood. And he also noticed the alarming pattern of folks, regardless of whether or not they were experiencing negative health outcomes due to their smoking, still continued the risky behavior. Those same patients, again, reported having a history of childhood sexual abuse in their past. When Dr. Anda and Dr. Felitti decided to compare notes, they decided to embark on a revolutionary study. This epidemiological study, now known as the ACE study, confirmed with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increased the risk for physical, mental, and behavioral health problems within the community under study. And I'm going to talk to you about those findings throughout this presentation. Before I talk to you about the ACE study, I need to talk to you a little bit about how the individual body processes environmental stimuli and how that processing aids in child development over the course of the lifespan. So if you can see on your screen a diagram of the human nervous system. If you can imagine your 5 senses, you're listening to my voice, you're perceiving the temperature in the environment through your sense of touch. You can even see my visual that I'm presenting on the screen. Those different inputs are coming into your 5 senses as environmental stimuli, and they're being sent up through your central nervous system to be processed in your brain. Your brain is uniquely adapted to process this information in almost a millisecond. And in actuality, your body and your brain survival depends upon your brain being able to process that information quickly and making decisions about what to do about that information. For children, all of these environmental stimuli are contributing to brain development in many different ways. If you can see on my left-hand side of the screen, you can take a look at what brain cells or neurons look like at the point of birth. You can see a lot of spaces in between the brain cells. There's not a lot of brain cell activity, and there's not a lot of connections between the brain cells, and that's by design. Infants, of course, are born with limited abilities, and they're completely dependent upon their caregiver in order to provide them with the stimuli they need to promote optimal brain development. As children grow and develop, brain cells are strengthened and they grow depending upon the input from the parent, the caregiver, as well as the environment around them. Brain cells are strengthened through repetitive, nurturing caregiving, as well as positive cognitive environments that stimulate brain development. And as you can see in the middle slide, there's so many brain connections that are happening and very little spaces between brain cells. The brain cell spaces that you see on the screen are called synapses, and the growing or the strengthening of brain connections to look like almost a tree is called branching or arborization. Ideally, as children grow in optimal environments where they're loved and cared for by their parents and their caregivers, this arborization continues throughout puberty and promotes children learning and acquiring new skill sets, as well as maturing across the lifespan. As children grow and develop into puberty, brain cells are pruned or cut off if different skills are not utilized and the brain perceives that those particular skill sets or knowledge are no longer needed. But what happens for children who don't necessarily grow up in the best of conditions? We already know through our work with children that unfortunately, not all children grow up in safety. Let's talk about some children on the blue half of the pathway. As you can see, there are children in the United States who grow up in relative safety for the most part. And ideally, that's what we would like for all of our children. Children who grow up in relative safety have the benefit of acquiring certain skill sets related to people, process, and possibility. Because they have loving and nurturing parents and caregivers that support optimal social and emotional brain development, they learn people skills. They learn how to perform pro-social behavior. They learn how to acquire friends and get what they want and need from other caregivers in the environment. They learn about process. They learn that there's a particular way of doing things and there's a particular step-by-step process in order for them to get what they want. And for the most part, when they complete that process, children who grow up in relative safety understand that they will get what they desire. Because children in relative safety learn skills around people and process, they're able to do a lot of future thinking. They grow up in possibility. There's goal setting activities around them, whether they're be in school or in the home environment, and there's possibility and hope for the future. Children who grow up in relative safety, because they acquire those skills from the ideal environment, have brains that are uniquely adapted to survive in the best conditions. Are those children any worse or any better necessarily than the children who grow up in danger? No, their value has nothing to do with that. It's just that their brain, because of the environmental stimuli that has been inputted into it, has developed brain architecture that's uniquely adapted to survive in the best conditions. For children who grow up in danger, unfortunately, environmental stimuli constantly flooding the brain with dangerous signals cause the children's brains who grow up in danger to begin a fight, flight, or freeze response. This stress response is designed to protect the brain and the body from any traumatic dangers that may be in that child's environment at the time. So for children, for example, who may grow up with parents who are struggling with substance abuse, children who are experiencing physical abuse by their caregiver, children who are neglected, those types of children have environmental stimuli that are being transmitted to the brain through what's happening in the environment that is causing the brain to send a signal to the rest of the body to gear up for the challenge ahead. That signal to the body is called the stress response. And that stress response sends hormones like cortisol throughout the body to gear the body and the brain to meet the challenges in the environment they're in. The issue is that the brain and the body is not meant to be under a particular stress response for a prolonged period of time. And that overproduction of cortisol can be damaging to delicate brain and body architecture as children are growing across the lifespan. Because of that constant introduction of environmental stimuli that the brain interprets as dangerous or traumatic for the child that's in that particular environment, the brain begins to uniquely shape itself so that it can be uniquely poised to meet the challenges of the environment that the child finds itself the most in. Therefore, the child is not damaged, the brain is not damaged. On the contrary, the brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's shaping itself in order to survive in the worst conditions. We're going to take a look at a video about the science of neglect.
Matila, we are not hearing the sound from this video right now. It might be because you have your headphones in.
So sorry about that.
No worries.
Just for the sake of time, I'll move on, but I'll definitely post this video as a resource. Thanks so much.
Perfect, thank you.
So what happens to the brain as it's adapting itself to the environments that it finds itself in? For children who grow up in traumatic environments, the adaptation that the brain does as a result of the input of dangerous and negative environmental stimuli is actually shaping the brain to respond the best it can do, considering the challenging circumstances. When we put a child like this into a more structured environment, however, like school, churches, and other types of institutions, we run into a problem. Not because that child is damaged or maladaptive or undesirable in some type of way. It's simply because the brain's adaptations are not designed to meet the expectations that this particular environment is challenging itself to do. So what happens? We have children who grow up in trauma, who enter into the school system, who have problems adapting as well as producing the types of behaviors that teachers need to see in order to promote optimal classroom environments. In other words, you may have children who have undergone traumatic experiences, have a hard time producing certain behaviors like sitting still, attending to tasks, being able to sit in quiet environments, or even being able to emotionally regulate themselves when they're going through challenges with problem solving and other logic processes. We also have children who may grow up in relative safety, who may be placed in other types of environments where safety is not guaranteed, who may really struggle in those types of environments until their brain is able to come to a place where an environment can promote relative safety for them. So for example, children who are in natural disasters. So it's traumatizing for any child, whether they grow up in trauma or in relative safety, to be in a natural type of disaster environment. But for children who grow up in relative safety, they may not have any context or any relative skills that they could transfer in order to meet the challenges of their environment. And they could really be struggling. We also saw that recently during the pandemic. We had children who were really doing well prior to the health and safety emergency, but are now really struggling with challenges related to academic, cognitive, social, and emotional skill sets because they've been separated from institutions like school and have had a disruption in their routine for so long. So for folks who may have had experience with children or adults who may be struggling with traumatic experiences, you may find that some of the behaviors and some of the skill sets that are associated with folks who may have had brain architectural changes because of their experience with trauma, those behaviors may sometimes come across and be perceived as difficult or challenging. No doubt, folks who have suffered through trauma may be experiencing a overproduction of cortisol and a hypervigilance to stimuli that may be causing them to produce behaviors that are perceived by others, especially folks who may feel more safe in the environment, as behaviors that are unnecessary, undesirable, and sometimes perplexing. But through the science of through the science of adverse childhood experiences and learning about the ways in which individuals process trauma in the environment, we can try to develop more empathy for folks who may be in our environment and may be experiencing these conditions, and learn new and different skill sets in ways that we can become more trauma-informed care so we can better conserve this population. So we talked a little bit about the individual effects of trauma on both brain and body architecture as children grow and develop. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the epidemiological study called ACEs. So in the 1990s, the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente sponsored the epidemiological study now known as ACEs. And as I mentioned previously, the co-principal investigators of the ACEs study are Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti. Now, I will say that there's always been epidemiological studies about the relationship between one type of adverse childhood experience, like physical abuse, and its relationship between one or two types of negative health or social outcome. The ACE study, however, is revolutionary in the sense that it is looking at multiple types of health and negative social outcomes against 10 different types of traumatic experiences that an individual can experience over the course of the lifespan. So that is the adverse childhood experience. So as you can see from my screen, the 1990s ACE study covered 10 different experiences and categorized them into 3 different buckets of trauma. The first bucket is the household dysfunction trauma, and it covers issues like growing up with a family member or a caregiver who is struggling with substance abuse, experiencing parental separation, either through divorce or by death, looking at intimate partner violence suffered by the mom, and also looking at criminal behavior, incarceration of a parent or a caregiver that a child lives with at home. The other 2 buckets are pretty self-explanatory, looking at neglect from a physical as well as an emotional standpoint, and also looking at abuse. The ACE study had a total of 17,000 participants. Most of the participants were Caucasian, were college educated, also had high access to healthcare, and they also considered themselves to be either middle class or upper middle class in economic standing. But as you can see from the statistical results of this particular study, ACEs were still common in the population. The ACE study is not only revolutionary in looking at its relationship between multiple types of childhood trauma and adversity and multiple forms of negative health and social outcomes. It's also revolutionary in demonstrating to the public that ACEs doesn't just happen to the folks on the other side of the track. ACEs can happen to anybody, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, or economic standing. When we look at the 17,000 study participants, we looked at folks who were between the ages of 19 to 94, and folks who came through all different types of the spectrum. And we can see from this study that there was a high statistical probability that you would see these adverse childhood experiences within that study population. Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti needed a way to conceptualize this relationship between these multiple adverse experiences and multiple health and social outcomes. So they come in with the ACE score. An ACE score counts the number of traumatic experiences that an individual or a community group has had over the course of the lifespan. So the ACE score is not a diagnostic tool. It does not talk about the frequency of one's abuse or traumatic experience, nor does it speak to the severity of that experience. It also doesn't take case histories or talk about details around that particular person's traumatic experience. So it can't be used as a diagnostic tool. I also want to mention that the ACE score, because it's not a diagnostic tool, is a part of the epidemiological study that talks about correlation. So when we look at someone's ACE score, that doesn't necessarily mean that that particular individual or that community is going to automatically experience some kind of negative health and social outcome because of their history of trauma. It does mean that there's a correlation or a relationship within study populations between the number of folks within a community that report having negative adverse childhood experiences and the same percentage of folks who report having had experienced a negative health and social outcome at the time of the studies conducting. So let's talk about that relationship. As the number of ACEs being reported within the study population rose, the percentage of health outcomes that were negative increased within the same population. That relationship, according to Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti, is called the dose-response relationship. And as you can see, the number of folks reported having experienced 5 or more ACEs, about 55% of folks within that given population reported experience some kind of negative health or social outcome. Not only do we see this in folks who are reporting issues around negative health outcomes, we also see this when we talk about the social determinants of health. So even folks who are not necessarily engaging in risky behavior themselves, but folks who find themselves in relationship with folks who are struggling with risky behavior can be at risk for this dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences being reported in the population and the number of negative health and social outcomes. So as you can see, even folks who are married to alcoholics who report having had at least 4 or more issues with adverse childhood experiences over the course of their lifetime, you can see that less than 35% of that particular population reported having experienced some kind of alcohol-related problem. So even if you're looking at the alcoholic or the one who doesn't necessarily have the issue, but the one who's married to someone who may be experiencing alcoholism, both can have negative health and social outcomes because of this relationship between childhood adversity and negative health and social health over the lifespan. When we look at ACEs and depression, so depression is the #1 mental health diagnosis in most developing nations. And I hate to use the term, I'd prefer in industrially developed nations. So even if we take into account for gender differences in reporting, we can see again that dose-response relationship as the number of ACEs being reported in a given community population increases, the higher the percentage of health and social outcomes within that given population. So we see it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, even if we account for differences in reporting with depression, we can see a strong relationship between childhood adversity and negative health outcomes over the course of the lifespan. Taking a look at some more ACE-attributable health outcomes like liver disease, obesity, but those that may not necessarily be familiar or things that you may not necessarily think of when you think of this relationship between childhood adversity and negative health and social outcomes. Workplace problems. So we know that folks who may have experienced trauma over the course of their childhood may not have acquired the skill sets needed to be able to confront issues in the workplace. We also know that brain architecture may have been significantly changed and altered so that that particular individual may be experiencing environmental stimuli in the environment way differently than someone who may not have necessarily undergone that same trauma. And that experience, that overproduction of cortisol and that hypervigilance of stimuli can really affect folks who work in certain work environments. especially for folks who may work with manufacturing and machinery, or may work in places where they may experience vicarious trauma as a social worker, a police officer, military personnel, etc. Fetal death. We see that as a big ACE attributable health problem, especially when we look at the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. So we know that there are epigenetic changes. There are changes that can happen at the DNA and cellular level that tell our body to express certain messages and genetic information that code for particular traits. We know that particular traits can be turned off or turned on, as we call it, by these epigenetic changes. And that off or on transmission can greatly influence the ways in which different behavior traits, as well as disease predilections, can come up in a particular individual. So we know that fetal death occurs not only through that epigenetic change at the cellular level, but can also occur through risky behaviors that moms in utero can practice. It can also come from harsher parenting practices that can occur. It can also come through environments that are not necessarily ideal for the protection and the ideal supervision of newborns. So from the ACE study, the original ACE study, we've learned a couple of different things. We know that ACE scores were high within that particular study population. And if it was high in a study population that was mostly Caucasian, who had access to really good health care with high education and economic attainment, you can imagine that subsequent ACE studies that have looked at urban areas like Philadelphia, that have looked at rural areas, and that have looked at ACEs by ethnic background, you can imagine the difference in ACE scores. If you're interested in learning more about the ACE scores in Maryland, you can also take a look at Maryland Department of Health study. They've collected a lot of ACE data through their behavioral risk assessment survey that they it's a telephone survey that they call Maryland citizens, and they ask them about a wide range of questions related to their health and health access. And that telephone survey includes information about ACEs broken down by county, by region, and as well as some youth ACE scores for the state of Maryland. So if you're ever interested, you can check that out. We learned through the original ACE score that there was an increased risk of multiple health and social outcomes. And the ACE study actually looked at 10 different adverse childhood experiences, which I showed you in the other screens. But they also looked at 18 different multiple negative health and social outcomes. And over again, they saw that dose-response relationship between adversity in childhood and negative health, behavioral, and social issues. And of course, like I mentioned, the intergenerational transmission of ACEs through the epigenetic changes that occur at a cellular level as different enzymes bind to different proteins on DNA, telling them to open, read, and turn on or turn off genes that are coded for certain behavior traits and disease traits. So when we're looking at Maryland and things that in Maryland are doing to combat some of the ACEs, we can't forget that the original ACE study looked at just 10 different types of adversities that one can experience over childhood. We know that as practitioners that work with children and families, that there can be a whole host of traumatic experiences that children can go through. If you're interested in learning more about ACEs, you can look at the different types of realms of ACEs. And that covers things like household issues like homelessness, bullying, emotional abuse. It covers community ACEs like structural racism, community violence, and historic trauma. And it also covers environmental ACEs like natural disasters. When we look at ACE mitigation and prevention efforts, we can take a look at it using a population attributable risk score. So this kind of estimates what percentage of different health and social outcomes we can improve if we just work on ACE mitigation and prevention. As you can see, if we just work on ACE mitigation and prevention in the community, we can potentially reduce the risk of HIV in community by 51%. We can reduce the amount of folks who are drinking and driving over the past 30 days by 45%, and we can reduce issues like alcoholism, chronic depression, and smoking. When we look at community capacity development, we can look at some of the things that Maryland has done around ACE mitigation and prevention. So we look at SCAN, the Maryland the Maryland State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect. It's actually a federal mandate under the federal law CAPTA that mandates how states are to treat as well as legislate issues around child abuse and the treatment of children in out-of-home care. Federal law establishes SCAN as a citizen review panel, and it makes recommendations to the governor as well as the state agencies on the prevention, detection, prosecution, and treatment of child abuse and neglect. Just looking at the SCAN membership, there are 8 state agencies as well as 15 governor appointments. The executive director of SCAN is now Claudia Remington. Looking at the different committees within SCAN that provide grant funding for issues like investigation and prosecution, looking at all the different citizen review panels that fall under SCAN, like the Citizens Review Board for Children and the State Child Fatality Review Team. Also looking at the ways in which the state provides technical assistance around child abuse and neglect prevention activities, including its premier organization, Maryland Family Network. Looking at the different SCAN work groups that one can participate in, it touches on issues related to child welfare, racial equity and child welfare programming, current issues like COVID-19, and issues around childhood fatalities throughout the state. Looking at the different ways that SCAN operates, you can take a look at the larger Maryland collective that's aimed at ACE mitigation and prevention called the Maryland Essentials for Childhood. So the SCAN is a federally mandated committee that is designed to handle issues around childhood abuse and neglect. Maryland Essentials for Childhood takes a larger view of childhood abuse and neglect and centers it in a comprehensive strategy designed to promote the prevention as well as the mitigation of adverse childhood experiences. It does that by reaching out to all different practitioners statewide. So anyone can join the Maryland Essentials for Childhood effort, and at the end you'll see on the screen ways to reach out and connect with them. They do provide technical assistance. So they've worked with the Centers for Disease Control to work on issues around ACE prevention and mitigation in the state of Maryland. And this particular initiative, the ACE Interface Public Education Campaign, is housed under not only the family tree, but in partnership with the Maryland Essentials for Childhood. Not only do we have a commitment to ways to raise awareness around adverse childhood experiences and the science of trauma, we use all of our efforts here at Maryland Essentials for Childhood to encourage state agencies like Maryland Department of Health to collect data around adverse childhood experiences, to use that data to create the context for programming, policies, and practices, and to galvanize the efforts of all folks in community who are working on ACE prevention and mitigation, and providing them with tools, strategies, and education in order to be able to be the most effective in the community. So again, here's the things that have been accomplished. One thing I'll mention in particular is the new Elijah Cummings Baltimore City Trauma Care Act. The data that's been collected, as I mentioned, the births data around ACEs for adults as well as youth populations. And there's been a lot of action in Frederick County around collecting data around youth ACEs amongst their high school populations. Looking at the different ways in which we've applied the science to create interventions throughout the state. One example that is really innovative is the Safe Babies Court in Frederick County. So for moms who are struggling with substance abuse, who may birth infants who may be struggling with substance abuse exposure, Instead of automatically taking those children away and placing them in out-of-home care, moms are funneled into something called a safe baby court, where they are receiving wraparound services as well as drug treatment and other mental health supports, so that they can stay with their baby, bond with their baby through the period of separation, if that's appropriate, and then being able to reunite with the baby with those new skill sets and the attachment relationship still intact. Looking at the different legislative activities around ACEs, I don't know if you've heard recently, Governor Hogan declared about 2 months ago a Maryland Adverse Childhood Experiences Day, where he acknowledged the negative effects of trauma on brain and body development, and he asserted his commitment to ACE mitigation and prevention. There's also been a newly created commission on trauma-informed care that's going to make recommendations to the governor around ACE mitigation and prevention. Some more legislative efforts. And here, if you're interested again in joining SCAN, you would go to marylandessentialsforchildhood.org and fill out their contact form, and you'd be invited to meetings where you can hear all different current findings and activity around the state of Maryland, and you can contribute as well to their different work groups. If you're interested in learning more about what the family tree does, we have a 1-800 number, or you can reach out to us via online. And for the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to take questions and make sure that I address any issues or comments that anyone may have about the presentation.
Thank you so much, Matila. If anybody does have a question, you can submit it via the comment platform on YouTube or Facebook, whichever you're viewing on. And those will populate for us over here so we can ask those to Matila. I will start off with something that's been kind of a discussion amongst our members of our Violence, Injury, and Trauma Action Team. We've been talking about kind of the difference between the Philadelphia ACEs survey and the original ACEs survey. I'm just wondering if you had any experience comparing the two of those, or any experience with that.
Well, we know that the difference in study population is going to be key. So the Philadelphia ACEs is looking at folks who are living in urban community. The demographic is different, but the spread as far as the age and the number of participants under study were similar. So in other words, there was a good spread in age, and there were a large number of study participants. Of course, when you're looking at urban environments, you're going to have different issues under study. So the Philadelphia ACE study looked at issues like community violence and about the issues with the experience of racism and how that can be considered an ACE, because not only of its damage to folks over the course of the lifespan, but it's ways in which it can change epigenetic structures at the cellular level. The original ACE study didn't necessarily go into those particular traumatic experiences.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we're looking at potentially trying to collect a little bit of data comparing the two. Since we're such a rural setting, it'll be interesting to see maybe the difference in that, because it does look, as you were saying, kind of, it looks at that community level traumas rather than maybe personal traumas, and kind of incorporates that as well.
That's right, yes.
Give it a second for any other questions come through. We did have a comment come through from Carmen. Great presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Carmen.
And I was wondering, maybe potentially right now you could take a chance to talk about any trainings that the Family Tree offers. I know since you are kind of that Maryland statewide agency, if there's training opportunities for any of our local participants that they'd be able to join in on.
Sure. So if you're interested in learning more about ACEs, we offer trainings for community organizations as well as in community periodically. We offer resilience film screening opportunities, as well as trainings on mandated reporting and child sexual abuse, human trafficking, and the impact of trauma on family systems.
Perfect. Thank you. right, and I am not seeing any questions come through. While I give it that kind of extra 30 seconds, because I know we are on a little bit of a delay here, I'll just say thank you so much, Matila, for joining us today. We really appreciate your presentation. It's such an important topic to bring up, and trauma-informed care, I know, has become such a big push locally. So it's great to kind of hear more about adverse childhood experiences and things like that.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. For all of our participants, this next 45 minutes on our agenda from 2:45 till 3:30 is actually going to be our virtual exhibit hall time. So we really do encourage you to go over to the HSMP website and check out our virtual exhibit hall. On the webpage, you'll be able to go in and join a virtual meeting with different organizations locally to make that connection, to network, to learn more about their programs. There's also different files and links available on the website so that you can incorporate any of those flyers that they have into your outreach and into your programs locally. So I really do encourage you to go check that out and network with some of our different organizations. We've got lots of different thank yous coming through. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You all have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Thanks, Matila.